Your stories don't define you, but how you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and Chief Storymaker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, and to connect. But what we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. When you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived as you're sharing them. When you figure out which stories to share, the next step is to develop how you share them. Normally, when I'm working with communication clients, I remind them to listen to understand, not necessarily to respond. It's easy when you're hearing somebody else's story to get lost in your own. But in this series, I'm asking you to listen and consider your related stories. To listen and think about which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. Today's podcast features my friend JeanAnn Nichols, an engineer in Northern California. JeanAnn, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me on this podcast, Your Stories Don't Define You. For our audience, I was totally enamored with your profile on LinkedIn because of all the tech background, but it seems like you figured out a great way to blend tech with people skills, and not a lot of people can walk that fine line. So just to begin, I would love to ask you the question that I always ask my guests. Tell us something about you that most people wouldn't know, that we wouldn't see on your resume or your LinkedIn profile.
Well, it's really nice to be here, Sarah. Thanks for inviting me for the chat. You know, one thing that not very many people know about me is, while I've done a lot of technical leadership and business leadership, in my younger days, I was very involved in theater and rock bands. And
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it created some interesting challenges. My sister, I have an older sister, I've got a bunch of kids, but my older sister was in financial services. She was trading on the boards, so she would wake up at 4 a.m. to take the train into the city before trading started. And I would be coming home from work at 4 a.m. From whether it was a theater performance or a rock band or something like that. And it made for a great time because we shared a room. So she'd be getting ready to get to work and I'd be getting ready to go to bed. And it was a nice symbiosis between us.
Wow. So how long did you keep your music and theater going into high school, college, young adulthood?
That was a great foundation for me. It actually helped me pay for university. So I continued in that reign on summer in university. So I was able to earn enough money to not work during the school year.
Wow. And did you play an instrument or do you sing?
I played an instrument. I did technical theater. So I was doing spotlights and lighting boards and sound systems.
Wow. And you played?
Bassoon.
Bassoon. In a rock band?
No.
Oh.
But I did like recordings for children's and commercials and things.
I was going to be so impressed
that
you
really
found
cool.
a way to play the bassoon in a rock
band. That would be really neat.
So what did you do in the rock band?
Oh, spotlights, lighting, design, sound.
Oh, okay. So you weren't playing music or singing in the band. You were
on stage.
You were crew. Oh my gosh. I love crew. They make the magic happen. They really do. Oh, that is fascinating. I am so glad you shared that.
You know, and it's funny because when you fast forward into my career where I was in engineering, it was a very male-dominated field from my first jobs that I ever had.
Right. So let's just jump right into the whole theme of the podcast, which is when the stories that you choose to make go against general societal norms. So you decided to go into engineering. Can you think of a story from your past that made you decide engineering was the way to go? Did you have like an awakening?
This is, I love this story. So I have to give thanks to my advanced placement biology teacher and swim coach, Eric Matz. I'm sure he's well retired by now, but he had a theory that if everyone chose to live where they wanted to live, you would have enough teachers, bus drivers, doctors, all kinds of folks that would make a community. And I thought that was a really interesting proposition. Instead of thinking about what contribution do I want to make to society or what lifestyle do I want to live, the lifestyle part is, where do you want to set up your home base? And I know this will resonate with you because of Montana. So
Right.
I decided I wanted to live in Northern California. I had been out on vacation out here, and I just love being, a half-hour drive to the ocean, a couple hours drive up to the mountains to go skiing, just the richness and the diversity of the Bay Area. So in high school, I said, okay, if my goal is to live in Northern California, what job could I have that would support me? And Silicon Valley was booming. So I said, great, I'm good at math, I'm good at science, I'll study engineering and I can get a job in Silicon Valley. So that's probably a little countercultural to say, where do I want to live? And then what profession do I have to take to be able to survive there?
That makes so much sense. And I love that theory that if you chose where you wanted to be, that in general, you'd be a happier person.
Yeah.
Well, that makes so much sense. And it's funny because when my husband and I decided to move to Montana, I had no interest in moving back west. I went to high school and college in Fort Collins, Colorado. And while I loved it there, I loved Washington, D.C. I loved the energy. I loved generally the weather. I mean, it was gray for a lot of the year, but we didn't get very much snow, so there wasn't a lot of shoveling. And that's something I really didn't like when I was in Colorado as a high school student. But he really wanted to move west. My spouse really wanted to move west. And when he was offered a job here in Montana, I said, no way, I'm not going. And this was when we had first found out we were pregnant with our first son. And I said, no, I don't want to be there. I love it here. My family's here. Your family's here. And when the baby was born, my priorities shifted. I know, that's shocking. And I realized that this whole idea, I had this novelty idea about what it would be like to be a working mother. And I didn't realize how much I'd want to be with the baby, because I didn't want children. And then suddenly I wanted children. So I didn't really have the mindset for it. But when he was offered the job again, when the baby was 5 months old, I said, take it, let's go. And now that I think about it, we picked this place and we have been here longer. Both of us traveled a lot. We moved around a lot as young adults and kids. He's a son of a Navy admiral. I mean, we just moved all over the place, and we've been here 19 years.
Wow.
So I love that theory.
Yeah.
So, and I love your story. So what happened? I mean, obviously you're good at what you do. Tell me something else about when you realized that this might not be the easiest path because of the fact that it's such a male-dominated industry.
I think there are a few things that really come to mind on that. Let me say two things. One is living in the Bay Area, it's very challenging unless you have a dual income family, right? The cost of living here is really quite high. So I went into it with an expectation that I would work for a long time. But I came to the realization that everything about life is seasons. Your career has seasons, your family life has seasons. There are times when you invest more in yourself, times when you invest more in your family, time when you invest in your education or in your career. And so, that took me a while to kind of come to that conclusion. So I think being in sort of a male-dominated field, but in a place where the spouse also has to work, really helped kind of create some balance, because there are a lot of people like me.
Right.
That said, an example, there's something called National Engineers Week. It happens in the first quarter of the year. And so companies will ask their engineers to go to the local elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools to show, there's also a hashtag, I'm an engineer, right? That says to show what do engineers look like. But so I went to a local elementary school, but the teacher didn't tell the children that it was National Engineers Week. They said, we have a special guest today. And I was probably 8 months pregnant with my second child.
Oh,
and I walked in and the teacher said, so our special guest today, what do you think her profession is? And the students said, teacher, nurse, I think librarian. And I was just like, oh, wait a minute, kids. We got a conversation to have here. And when she said engineers, the kids were really, really surprised. But it was a really fun program because I got to bring in some pulleys and do, science experiments that kids would enjoy doing.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully that really kind of opened their eyes. Wow, this pregnant lady came in and she's an engineer.
Wow. Did that change how you talk to your children at all?
Oh, I think so. I think that there's a number of things. My children growing up here, it's incredibly rich ethnographically. So they went to an elementary school where there were 38 native languages spoken.
Wow.
They didn't break out, I'm Caucasian, they didn't break out the test scores because there were only 6 white kids in the school. And 2 of them were Ukrainian. So, where they grew up kind of changes their worldview. But certainly having a working parent who worked in engineering certainly provided them with perspective that can only be helpful.
Well, you were a model to them just by the nature of your job and what you did. But I guess I'm asking because that's the kind of thing that would startle me into discussions with my children, not just the ones at the school, and the teacher, because clearly our teachers have a lot of work cut out for them if students just so recently, what was that, 10 years ago?
It's a little while ago, yeah.
Yeah, 10 years ago, but that's only 10 years ago. That was 2006, 2008. And you look at that and you think, kids are still making assumptions about what a woman would do. Those assumptions? I mean, that is shocking to me, especially in your region. That is shocking to me. And when that kind of thing happens in my life, I immediately go home and talk to my kids and say, well, what do you think of this? Are you surprised by this?
Yeah, it's an
Wow.
interesting conversation to have, right?
And especially now.
Male and female teachers.
Right.
And your kids have male and female soccer coaches.
Right. And do you go to a male and female doctor?
Right.
Wow. So even if they're modeling it, kids are still not necessarily picking up that you can do anything.
Wow. And I think, you really have to see it to be it.
Yeah.
I think that visual is so important, which was important for me to participate in National Engineers Week.
Right. Have you done that every year since?
I do that most years. I really do enjoy it because it is kind of fun for the aha moment.
Are there any other situations related to that Engineer Week and experiences like that you would that stick in your memory?
Certainly when you do like tabletop workshop type activity, it's entertaining to me to see groups of boys and groups of girls doing the same activity and kind of their approach to problem solving. And this is just my personal observation. I haven't done research on this, but I do tend to find that sometimes the girls will chat a lot about things and the boys will just get started and start trying things, and sometimes competitively start trying things. And I always find it intriguing to watch them and then ask each table to explain how they approach the problem and see if they can see differences in their approach.
So you think that your experience is mostly that the girls are more collaborative? Is that kind of where
I think in general, and I guess this is not scientific, I think the girls are very collaborative and perhaps more risk averse. Like they don't want to do it wrong. So they're going to think about it before they do it. Whereas the boys are like, well, I know how to do this. I'm just going to get it done. And if it fails, we'll just pick up the pieces and do it again.
Wow. I would be really interested to see some research.
I'm sure there's research on it.
Especially in relation to, is it a societal thing or is it a nature thing? Is it our nature to be more risk averse and more collaborative because we want to share the risk? Or is it something that we learn? Those are great stories. I'm sure that our listeners will be thinking about this and puzzling over it and observing more as a result of hearing these stories.
Well, and I imagine there's a cultural overlay.
Definitely.
If you grow up in China, where women held up half the sky, the environmental situation may change how that plays out.
So let's come back just briefly to these stories and how they shape you as a person. Do you think that because of your position as an engineer and then as a leadership consultant or somebody who works with leaders, do you find that your engineering background and the stories that you take from that impact the way that you approach your leadership training and what you do?
Well, I'm certain the foundational training that engineers go through in problem solving influences my outlook. I'm certain the amount of travel I've done globally has changed my worldview. When you see things firsthand and you see how different people do similar things, it can't help but open possibilities for you on what could be next. And I think that the processes we go through to integrate that and the stories we tell ourselves are incredibly powerful.
So can you think of anything from one of your travels just off the top of your head that really impacted you and that you still think about?
Well, there's so many stories about places you've gone and things you've seen and the way people do them. I think a big contrast for me is hospitality that I see around the world and most parts in America, in the US. While we do have, good Southern hospitality, or you could say Midwesterners are really friendly and giving, my experience internationally has been people really go out of their way to make you feel at home and to help you see things the way they are. So when I come home and I have international visitors, I actually change my behavior to make sure that I really do reach out and say, hey, I saw that you're in town. Can I take you somewhere? Can I show you something?
That's really insightful. I had a similar experience, or I have similar experiences with my travel where when I ask for directions, people will go out of their way to help me, no matter where I am. In Paris, even, where people, there's that reputation, but I didn't experience that at all in Paris. People were more than willing to be kind and help me, and especially because I didn't speak the language very well. And yet when I moved to Montana, people were shallowly helpful, but there was no real connection. And it took me a long time because Montanans generally are pretty insulated. And especially nearly 20 years ago when I moved here, they just didn't have the tools that we have now to connect outside of our little circles. When we moved here, it was still dial-up. And there are places in Montana that still don't have internet, much less high-speed internet. And if you think about it, there are places in India that are just coming up into a decent development in terms of their economy, and they have more high-speed internet, more access to high-speed internet than we do here in the state of Montana. And so I think you're right, and part of that is a geographical difference, because all the places that I've visited, like in Europe and Australia, have been highly populated. So, wow, that's definitely something to consider. Huh.
Yeah, and you get these images in your mind, right? So
right.
The man on donkey back in a developing country with his cell phone, who does all his business off his phone, and you think that's pretty amazing, but it's the leapfrog effect, and that's how they got to, how they're going to grow their own economy. Right. Take advantage of the resources that are available.
Did you see that? Did you see somebody on a
donkey? I've seen people on camelback with their cell phone, and you think that's funny. Or you go into certain countries in Southeast Asia where someone will stack 3 phones on the table, because this was kind of before multi-SIM phones, where different carriers offer different prices on texting versus voice versus internet service. And so they'll have multiple devices to be able to get the best value for their money.
Wow. Where did you see somebody on camelback doing that?
Oh, in the Middle East.
Where?
Where was I? Probably in Dubai. Just you get to the outskirts and it's the city versus the country sort of view.
Right. Is there anything from that experience a specific story that you can recall?
Nothing's coming to mind. I think I'm always delighted. Oh, actually, let me tell the story. So I must have been in Thailand, and there was a big celebration coming up. And so all of the young monks were folding flowers and folding leaves to make these arrangements for the temple. And the senior monks were sitting up on big chairs, and all of the young boys were sitting on the ground and doing this work to make these arrangements for the temple for tomorrow's celebration. And the older monks that were supervising the younger monks would sometimes kind of nod off in their chair, and the boys would quickly pull cell phone out of their pocket and start texting or playing video games. I actually took some photos of them, and as soon as the senior person who was supervising them would kind of wake up, those cell phones would quickly get put back into their pockets. And it was probably a bit sacrilegious that they were supposed to be concentrating and putting their energy into these flower arrangements. But every time the senior guy nodded off, they were quickly back onto their electronics. So that was really a contrast between tradition and modern world, and boys being boys, right?
Right. Doing what they're not supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
Wow. I had such mixed feelings about that, because I agree children are going to do things and they're going to try to get away with things. It's what we all do. I mean, I certainly qualify. To this day, I qualify. It's not just a young thing. But at the same time, it's a little sad to think about what a lack of a presence they have, that they're not in the present moment. They're not, they have this easy distraction. Back before these days, it wasn't as easy to be distracted with something so hideable. They could easily pick it up now and people wouldn't notice. But back, before that, they'd have to be distracted by other things, their friends, kicking each other. I mean, think about when my family was at temple on Saturday mornings in the Jewish temple, we would do the whole elbow on the armrest thing, wrestling with our elbows, and that's how we distracted ourselves. And when I think about that, I have actually fond memories of it, even though we got in trouble for it, because it was the connection that we made with each other. And what these boys are doing is they're distracted by themselves. They're not distracted by their relationship with the young boy next to them. And I find that just a little bit sad.
Yeah, and I don't know what they were doing on their phones. So, maybe they
could have been texting each other
and practicing them, but I'm suspecting it was something more entertaining.
Yes, and they could have been texting each other, because then they don't have to whisper.
Right.
We'll go with that. That's how we're going to visualize it, because it's not quite so depressing as playing games by themselves. Wow. And, it's funny too, because our children are playing these games, and sometimes I find myself getting a little judgy about it. But recently I was listening to a conversation my younger son was having. He's 16, and he was actually on a headset playing a video game with 5 of his buddies that are actually local, and they're all talking and laughing and playing this game together. And the judgment went out the window, because I thought, this is social. This is a social activity, and that's really what we're going for at this point.
It truly is a shared experience, right?
Yeah.
But I do think about young people coming into the workforce and needing a little of social etiquette also, how you need to look someone in the eye when you're speaking with them, firmly shaking hands, doing a call and response sort of conversation. Whereas when you're working with asynchronous technology, like texting and posting and snapping, being in the workforce, there is a need to have some of these social etiquettes practiced to be able to be effective.
Yeah, I talk a lot about that on my blog posts and in my No Longer Virtual conferences, that we're kind of forgetting how to communicate face-to-face. And as humans, we are designed to communicate face-to-face, touch, feel, all those senses that that make us connect more authentically with another human being. So yeah, Yeah, I completely agree with that. Well, let's get back to one last story before we wrap this up. Do you have any memories of your early years in engineering programs, or in your engineering program, where you were the only woman or one of very few women that you had an experience that you would want to share?
Well, I went to University College London. There were 3 women in the university, so it was pretty rare to have a cohort, in a class.
Wow.
And then I came back to the United States and went to the University of Illinois in Champaign. And there it was probably a peak women in engineering time. Probably 20% of the students were women. So you'd always have 3 or 4 other women in your class. But I guess my frame of reference there wasn't very gender oriented, because my best study pals were physically proximate to me. So it was another guy who shared the house with me, my across the street neighbor who was a physics PhD student. So I was using the resources that were close at hand, and being kind of gender blind to that, just like, how do I get this work done and make it happen?
But were they gender blind to you?
I don't think they really cared. I think we were just trying to get through school together,
Wow, that's refreshing. That's
and
not
maybe
the
that was
kind of
just
story
my
that I've
frame
heard
of mind.
before.
I don't know what they were thinking, right?
Well, perspective is everything. That's all that really matters, is perspective. Did you have any particularly positive experiences where it was about your gender with a professor or another student?
I don't remember from my student days. When probably my second job out of university, I got hired into a group of engineers that had a woman manager, and the leader above her was also a woman. So we had a group of 6 women engineers and a man called Bill Love. So we actually had a bowling group called Women in Love. That, I think, was probably transformative, to be working that soon out of school with an entirely female crew.
Wow.
The way people communicated with each other was probably very unique. And I probably stayed at that company because I had such a good starting experience with women leaders, women fighting for resources and getting them. So that was really inspiring.
Wow. And was that team recognized by the rest of the organization, or do you have any recollection of that?
It's funny. It was a very quality team. We published some papers. We had some good scientific success, but I don't ever remember it being called out for being a bunch of women.
Good. That's actually really promising to hear that it's about your accomplishments and not about your gender at all. That's something my friend Nicole Chardonnay up in Canada talks a lot about, is that it really shouldn't be about being women. It should be about our accomplishments. And wow, that's really encouraging and a little surprising to me. When I asked you to be on the podcast, my expectation, because of the stories that I've heard in the past, was that you would have these, not necessarily negative stories, but narrative building stories that would resonate with other women that are in more male-dominated fields. But it's really refreshing to hear that it was more about the engineering. It was more about living where you wanted to live and doing what you needed to do as a human being, as a professional, as opposed to having to fight as a woman. So
I think and I think if you go through, all of the history, different roles that I had one really amazing opportunity to lead an organization. And I was the first woman leader they'd ever had. And I had 2 more senior than me men that were going to report to me. And I know that there was some trepidation of, who is this chick and what she got that she's going to teach me? And when I left that role 3 years later, these 2 men couldn't be bigger supporters of mine and my technology and my expertise, and that they learned differently. And I think what I left that role with was being so grateful that I was able to show them that there was a different way of leading, that the job didn't have to be done the way it had been done in the past. And so when they saw me come in, they're like, how's this chick going to do it? Well, I did it my way. Right. And that probably opened the doors for them and people that worked for them to consider there are many ways of effectively getting a job done. And I learned so much from them. I mean, it was fantastic having people so senior working for you, and then being able to kind of flip that around and see that they learned as much from me as I learned from them.
That's terrific. I like that so much, partly because I've been there, where you're placed in a position where people have certain expectations and you're able to turn it around. But what I like the most about this story is that you were an ambassador, not just for women, but for doing things differently and changing the way that we think about that, especially in terms of leadership. So I love that you were such a good ambassador for us, because it ends up having such long-term implications for the people that work for them in the future and for the people that they work for in the future or with. I mean, regardless of level or status, they probably, my guess is that it changed the way they look at all women. So thank you for being such a great ambassador for engineers and for women and for doing things in different ways. Appreciate that. All right, then. I think this topic has, not that it's run its course, because we could go on. And I'm looking forward to learning more about you and learning more about your stories, because I have a feeling we could spend some time and find some really interesting ones to dig into and apply to current events and current situations. But for our listeners, I will be writing an associated blog post for this podcast that will be published, and you can get in touch with JeanAnn via LinkedIn. I'll put her LinkedIn profile link on there and a little bio, and you can go from there. My guess is that you're going to have an influx of people wanting to connect with you, JeanAnn, because you definitely have a lot to share, and I'm looking forward to learning more.
Sarah, thank you so much for the opportunity to come and have this chat. It's been absolutely delightful. Sharing our stories is really important.
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going?